Hi, my name is Trina Hinksathorn, and I am doing the screencast assignment number 1. The topics I will be covering today are entities, attributes, and relationship types. So for entities, an entity is a noun that describes a person, place, object, event, or concept. Usually it's correspondent to the row. Examples of entity are customers, car, houses, lakes, books, movies, and theaters. As you can see here, on these 3 tables, there are employees as your entity, customers as your entity, and orders as your entity. Now we have an entity type. An entity type is a collection of entities. It's usually represented by a table. An entity instance is a single occurrence of an entity type. In our next example, we have a table representation and our entity type, which is employees, and our entity instances as highlighted here. Each one of these are entity instances. Types of entities. There are 2 types of entities, strong and weak. A strong entity is an independent entity and it's usually unique. Weak is a dependent entity on a strong entity. The relationship is usually identified by a double line. As you can see here, we have a double box to represent our weak entity and a single box to represent our strong entity. Our relationship is denoted by a double line. That's how you know that the weak entity is dependent on this strong entity. So a final exam is dependent on the section of the class. Now we have attributes. Attributes are properties or characteristics of an entity. It's usually denoted by a field. So in this table representation, like our last one, we have our entity, which are our employees again, and our attribute. Each one of these, our employee number, our first name, last name, and date of birth is our attribute. Our entity instances, which is 101, David, Bristol, and they're all separate entity instances. Now there are 2 types of attributes that I'm going to go over. So we have required versus optional. Required means you must have a value in that field. And optional is that you can have it, but that doesn't mean you have to have it. So an example here is let's do this attribute right now, date of birth. This must be an attribute field. So we have to have a date of birth entered into these fields. However, our optional, which is our employee office number, not every employee has an office number. And so this is optional. David Bristol has an office number 50B, whereas Mary Manning does not. Maybe she's an intern. We don't know. And that's why it's a null. Now we have simple and composite. So simple attribute, if we go back here, simple attribute is just your regular first name and 1 field. However, your composite attribute has meaningful component parts, such as your employee address. Here you have your employee address and it requires 4 parts to it. Your street number, your street name, your state, and your zip code. All of these are a composite attribute. Multi-valued. A multi-value attribute may take more than 1 value for a given entity instance. An example would be that an employee can have more than 1 skill. A derived attribute is that the value is calculated from a related attribute value. So an example of that would be an employee age is calculated through the birthday. And if we go to our table, we can calculate the age from our attribute here. And when we do that, that is called a derived attribute. Now let's go into relationships. We have our relationship type, which is modeled on top of a line in between two entity types. An example of a relationship type, the complete part of the relationship right here. The relationship instance is modeled as a line in between the two entity types. So this is an instance. So this is the type, and this is the instance. The employee can have a task, but a task has to be completed by an employee. Now you have your cardinalities. Your cardinalities of a relationship represent what your minimum and maximum are. So you can have a one-to-one relationship, or a one-to-many relationship, or a many-to-many relationship. Here are an example of your cardinality constraints. So you have your mandatory one-to-one relationship, a minimum of 1 and a maximum of 1. If we go back, we can see that we have a one-to-one relationship. A task must be completed by a minimum of 1 employee and a maximum of 1 employee. And then you have your minimum of 1 and maximum of many, or infinity. So this is a mandatory cardinality. Your optional cardinalities are denoted with a circle. That means your minimum does or does not have to exist. So your minimum is 0, but your maximum is 1. And here is your minimum is 0, and your maximum is many. So let's look at the degrees of a relationship. So we have your unary, you have your unary, your binary, and your ternary relationships. Now there are two types of unary relationships. You're a one-to-one. So a person is married to another person. This is a one-to-one relationship, which means one person to one. Then you have your many-to-one or many-to-many relationship. So your employee manages one minimum or many employees. However, many employees can only be managed by a minimum of 1 employee or a maximum of 1 employee. Now let's go into binary. Binary has two entities. Your two entities have a relationship, and your relationship is shown here. Your theater has shows a maximum and a minimum of 1 movie, but your movie can be shown by a minimum of 1 theater or many theaters. This is a binary relationship. Then you have your ternary relationships, which is 3 attributes. 3 attributes denoted by a relationship. Now, a consultant signs a contract with a relationship. That is a relationship among 3 attributes. Let's go into associative entities types. So you have your binary relationship, as we saw before. I'm not going to talk about any of our minimum and maximum cardinalities because we already went over it. But we have our employee and our task. This is a binary relationship because this is a dotted line showing that you have an associative entity right here. Your employee can complete a task, but you want to have your date completed. And you know this is an associative entity by the dotted line. Now, an associative entity from here, we have A and B and your table, which your associative entity should have a curved circle. Well, not curved circle, but like a type, not straight, just curved. A curved edges. So your A has a cardinality of a minimum 1 and a maximum of many, and you have a table. Usually an associative entity is to split up a many-to-many relationship, and that's why the many-to-many relationship is facing the associative entity and not the other way around. And that is my screencast assignment number 1.